Good evening. My name is Tony Clark. I'm a member of the My Brother's Keeper Task Force, and I'm also a Cantabrigian. Tonight's conversation will be with Police Commissioner Christine Elow. Tonight we'll talk about a gamut of things, but more importantly, we will meet our commissioner. We're excited about today's conversation, as it's not only an opportunity for us to talk about the present, but to forecast the future and to dream big. So let's just jump right in. So thank you for joining us this evening. We're excited to have you here.
Thank
I
you
just want to, who is Christine Elow?
Sure.
Let's start there. Let's start there.
Thank you. So I am a Cantabrigian. Grew up in Cambridgeport, went to Morse School for grammar school, went to Cambridge Ringen Latin for high school. I graduated in 1985. Interestingly enough, when I was going through high school, I was kind of a wayward kid, I guess I'd put it that way. I really didn't have a lot of focus. One of the things that I remember is when I was a senior in high school, when I graduated, I didn't have a plan. I didn't take the SATs. I wasn't prepared for any college. I wasn't working. And then when I got out of high school, literally for 2 years, Tony, I wandered around kind of aimlessly, figuring out, what was I going to do with my life. And just to back up a little bit, so I grew up in an all-white family. I was actually adopted at birth. My racial background, I consider myself African American, but I am technically half black and half white. Don't know anything about my biological father, but my biological mother I know is white Irish. And the story that I got when I was put up for adoption is that my white Irish maternal family thought that I should be raised by my own kind, is the way it was explained to me. So I spent about a year actually in foster care before I was adopted by a white Irish Italian American family. And it's really interesting growing up, and I have an older brother who is white, I have a younger brother who is also white, and there's me in the middle. And people might see my light skin and say, well, yeah, you could have blended, but in my family, my hair is really big when it's out, and I definitely felt, and my parents, I think, were really purposeful about letting me know that I was black, and they told me from a very young age. I really didn't know what that meant, right? But they told me from a very young age that I was black. And I remember just a story when I was probably about 5 or 6 years old. When I first was adopted, we lived in Tewksbury, which is north of Boston. And I remember driving my bike down the street, and everybody in Tewksbury was white. And I was driving my bike down the street, and a bunch of the neighborhood kids were calling me these horrible names, like racial names. Like I remember chocolate bar and this and that. And my dad, who was home sleeping on the couch, I went home crying, Daddy, they're calling me names, they're calling me names. So my dad said to me, well, you go out there and you call them honkies. And I was 5. I didn't know what a honky was. And I thought he said donkey. So I back on my bike, I'm running out there, and I'm like, you donkeys, you donkeys. But for me, that was my first experience, I think, with racism, and also my first experience of just my resiliency, and just a bit of this kind of, a bit of a fighter in me. Sure. And after that, when my mom got home, one of the things she said is, we gotta get her out of here. And my mom and me, because my parents ended up divorcing after that, and my mom moved me and my brothers to Cambridge. So I grew up at 111 Pleasant Street, the corner of Pleasant and French. And for me, when I moved to Cambridge, that was the first time that I saw people that looked like me. Right. First time in my life seeing people that were other people of color. So I knew then, that I was home. And for me, and why I own Cambridge as my own, I feel like I'm a hardcore Cantabrigian, as I just felt the love, right, from this city. Just felt like I belonged here. I was still a little bit of a hot mess, because if you think about a mother who doesn't know anything about black hair, trying to do this hair, she didn't know how to do it, and I was kind of a hot mess growing up with, wouldn't let anybody comb my head because I was tender-headed, and I used to walk around with this big old nappy afro. If you knew me. So there's some people who knew me from way back then, So growing up, going through grammar school, I definitely felt a welcoming in the city of Cambridge. And then going through high school, I still was, and I don't know if it was part of being adopted or what it was, but I was kind of this rebellious kind of young person.
Sure.
And I think my mother doesn't really remember it, but I really think I gave her a run for her money when I was a teenager. I was pretty tough, which really leads to when I kind of didn't focus in high school, wasn't ready, so I wasn't an A student. I wasn't somebody that the teachers remembered. And I just remember going through high school, but I don't remember bringing a book home. I don't remember studying for a test. I don't remember getting any really value out of my education in high school. So then, again, when I got out, not knowing what I was going to do, and really not having, I mean, other than my mother who was saying, go get a job, go get a job, I really didn't know who I was or what I was going to do. And that is where I needed to find, some outlet, some structure to my life. And that's when I joined the Navy. And after that 4 years in the Navy, talk about structure and discipline that it instilled in me, that really prepared me for when I got out to take the police exam and to get on the police department. So I took the police exam in 1993, got on the police department in 1995, rose up through the ranks in the police department. I will say this about getting on the police department is that even through the training, one of the things that I noticed is that there were not a lot of women instructors.
Let's stay there for a second.
All right, sure.
So nationally, 1 out of 8 of our police officers and 1 out of 8 are women.
1 out of 8?
1 out of 8
okay.
are women.
All right.
It's roughly about 13%,
Yeah, right.
And in Massachusetts, we're lower than that 13%, right? And
In Cambridge specifically,
yeah, and
too.
so let's talk about that in terms of understanding those numbers, both nationally and locally, and obviously you spoke to your life and in some way, the anomalies, you was, and are, right? But you are one as well. Right now, when you think about, obviously in Philadelphia, you have Commissioner Outlaw.
Yes.
In Louisville, you have Commissioner Shields, who also, was the commissioner in Atlanta. But you also, had, I believe it was Commissioner Resch out in Portland, who went through a number of things, maybe predicated on, her gender. So how do you navigate this space, understanding both from the patrol to the top job? It's an anomaly.
It totally is. And I think it's an anomaly, but I think that what women bring to policing, just, I'm going to speak for me. I identify she, her are my pronouns, and I really feel like there is some value in what women bring to policing. I think the way that we approach policing is more about communication, more about gaining, overcoming resistance through good communication, through talking to people, just being able to really talk a situation down. And I do believe that a lot of my male counterparts think that this job is about brawn, it's about muscle. And it's not. I think it really is about being able to defuse and de-escalate, a situation by not coming in threatening, by coming in using good, persuasion and communication. I think women do that really, really well. So it's an anomaly, but I really do believe that, I think women are 51% of the population across the country, and we're less, like you said, 13%. I think if we had a lot more women in policing, we might see a lot less conflict.
I mean, one thing we also are confronting is the retention and recruitment. And so I think that obviously we can talk about the recruitment of African Americans and other, other BIPOC communities, but since we're talking about this particular space with women, I'm just curious, being a native, understanding the landscape, understanding some of the albatross that come with having to have a residency to be able to do to do this work, right? If it's yourself or police or fire, just that in itself can kind of create a barrier of entry. So keeping those things in mind and understanding kind of your lived experience, how do you help young women reimagine this particular space and create maybe a particular strategy to engage them?
It really is difficult because I came into a system that was developed, hundreds of years ago, but really even as it's evolved in a way that I think it gives preference to people who understand the processes.
Right.
So if you don't have people in your family, which I don't, that were police officers, you don't understand about the time constraints for the police exam, about the rigors of the police academy, even the fitness agility test that you have to do to get in. If you don't come from a police family, you're jumping in that new, and you really have to familiarize yourself with that. So one of the things that we're doing, there's many things that
Right.
I think we have to do, is instead of changing the process which is what I think really needs to be done,
Right.
we're preparing people, particularly women, and I will say residents in the city, for the rigors of those processes. You know, what it means to take the civil service exam, and really to even understand. I took the police exam in 1993. I didn't get on until 1995. 2 years. And Tony, with my military
Yep.
experience, I was #1 on the list. So that was how long it took to get onto the police department. So if somebody wakes up one day and says, I want to be a police officer, do you understand it's going to take 2 years for you to...
So as the commissioner, you know, I see our NAACP president in the audience as well. You know, one thing that we have received, myself and my colleagues at MBK, we have received calls from folks, particularly on the fire side, and this is not to disparage fire or in your case police, essentially like, look, I've scored really high. I've done everything that you've essentially told me to do. I've played by all the proverbial and literal rules, but I'm still not getting access to kind of navigate this space and to kind of be this champion for my particular city. So, you know, how do we, and obviously it's your job to kind of, you know, to do the work on the ground and to help, you know, shepherd your police department. But how do we get folks, at City Hall to think differently around, we have to be more intentional of getting these folks to take these exams, but also putting them in the position to get into the academy. And if you could talk a little more about the academy and what that looks like, and also maybe kind of we can be a little more advantageous than having just 10 folks in the academy, and maybe how do we get classes of 30 and 40? You know, what does that look like?
Which is what we need. And we got a lot of work to do for that. So let me first address the City Hall piece, because I think City Hall has done a remarkable job about trying to recruit Cambridge people to take these positions. And a big thing that they did, and this was, I think, in 2018, is we started the cadet program. Now, the cadet program, and oh my goodness, it's such a complex issue. When I took the police exam in 1995, there were probably 1,000 people waiting for police jobs. Just the police exam that we just had in, what is it, April or May, we have less than 100 residents on that list. Less than 100 that passed that civil service exam. So when it comes to, so there's a lot, so the cadet program is something that the city has invested in, so we can have, first of all, have Cambridge residents understand the process and prepare them for the rigors of the police academy, which was a really big deal. The other thing is around recruiting. So we're doing it, if you think about this, the city of Cambridge today, you have the very rich, right? And then you have the very poor. So we're doing a lot of our recruiting in our housing developments, which I think is wonderful because there's such a diverse group of people in our housing developments. But the problem with that is a lot of the diversity that we have there. We don't have generations of people who have been in policing, right?
To your earlier point.
Right, so now we have to prepare people, a lot of whom are immigrants, some women, some single mothers. How do we prepare them for the rigors of a police academy if you know nothing about it?
How do you engage those folks to even have an interest in the police academy if they've had historically adverse relationships with policing? Maybe not directly, but you know, as we all know, there's an intergenerational trauma with policing for some folks.
That's been a challenge. And so there's a couple of things that we have done, and very purposefully, I will say, over the past decade. The first thing that we did is we partnered with the Mayor's Summer Youth Program. So we have a group of young people. We started with about 15 that spend the summer with the police department in a youth police academy where they learn. We introduce them to policing. You know, there's some fitness, components to it. They visit a jail. We do trainings with them. They learn about speed enforcement and things of that nature. So that introduces them, and you should see the classes that we have. So that's for police and fire. And then when they get out of high school, so they can do that all the way up to their, 18, I think, the Mayor's Summer Youth Program. And then after that, for kids that were like me, that when you get out of high school, what's your plan? You don't need to have a plan. All you can do, so we can feed you into the police cadet program, which is a paid program where you have to go through this, like a small little, there's a test and there's some, a background investigation, but it's suited for young people. And then you get introduced to the police department, I think a lot more intensely than the Mayor's Summer Youth Program. But also, if you do 2 years successfully, you get preference on the civil service exam, 2 points. One of the things that I'll just kind of say is we just interviewed a class of, I think 7, and each one of the 7, just tons of diversity, but they all talked about the impact and the influence that their school resource officer had with their decision to become a police officer. So it really is engaging young people who might not be ready for that 4-year degree. Maybe military isn't the best fit for them, but they're interested in a career in public safety.
How do you, in that work, right, I guess I have a couple of questions, but I want to be respectful to time and making sure that we hit a number of topics. But one of the things that I find fascinating is that, and I don't want to mention particular cities because every city has their own context, right? There are some cities, I think oftentimes, you hear, at least I hear at city meetings, well, New York's doing this or San Francisco's doing this. Yeah. I like to look at cities that look like ours. If it's an Ann Arbor, or if it's a Pomona, or if it's a Shaker Heights, nonetheless. But there are some communities that look like ours and some that don't look like ours, that have been really intentional about putting police, I won't say academies in their schools, but opportunities for kids as young as 9th grade to kind of have some simulations of what policing looks like. Yes. And it kind of creates a culture, right? And as you know, there is a culture that is either real or perceived, or maybe a little in the middle. But how do you kind of capture those young people? I have a 9-year-old at home who talks about wanting to be a police officer.
Really?
However, in a lot of ways, that was stymied when he saw the George Floyd, George Floyd as a 7-year-old, right? And we'll talk about that a little later. But in terms of just curious, how do we engage the 9th grader at 9th grade? Not essentially where he or she feels like, I have nothing else going for me, let me just take this exam. Because then you get what does that look like? How do we engage that 9th grader from the onset?
Yeah, and something that we're doing here, and I think very purposefully, is we are out in our schools, we are out in the communities, conversations like this, where we talk about what we're doing differently here in the city of Cambridge. And one thing, and this is, I think, I don't remember who I had this conversation with, but they said, it might even been one of my children, they said, is it true that the police just arrest black people?
Yeah.
And having that conversation just to say no, and then really talking about what we're doing in the city. And this was very purposeful, I will say. It started probably 10 years ago. I see you have Charles Ogletree's book there, but after the arrest of Professor Henry Louis Gates, pivotal moment in the Cambridge Police Department, and how we engage and how we thought about, first of all, how we use our police powers, right? And how we engage, and also, even more importantly, how we disengage, right? What does that look like? And thinking about alternatives to arrest, and what is our bigger goal? So it started with the arrest of Professor Henry Louis Gates, and we embarked on this kind of focus on strengthening our legitimacy in the community through a process that it's called procedural justice, right? Treating people with respect and dignity, giving people a voice during the interaction, making sure that you have make decisions that are transparent and that are designed to build trust, right? So that was really a department-wide effort, and I will say, I don't know anywhere else in the country. Chicago did do some work like this, but I don't think as deep as Cambridge. And it really shifted who we are as a police department, and shifted all of our initiatives afterwards. How do we strengthen our legitimacy, and become a more procedural just police department, which meant looking at the root causes of issues. We started with our young people with the safety net program, and then moved to people who were struggling with substance abuse, our unhoused community, our youth, our seniors. How do we wrap arms around them, alternatives to the criminal justice system, and give them the support and the resources that they need. And I'll tell you, Tony, in a city like Cambridge, if anybody can get it right, we can get it right.
Let's stay there for a second. We hear that oftentimes, right?
We can get it right. We're doing it.
If anywhere can do it. But there are folks who, let's talk about kind of, we can start at the Gates conversation, or we can maybe end there. Sure. But I would be remiss not to mention that we had an incident here in our city. that in terms of, you know, it's a byproduct of where we are, where there are cell phones, and those cell phones capture things. And then oftentimes, they may capture a snippet, they may capture the totality of it. But could you give us what you can to kind of give us a context of that particular situation and where you guys are at with regards to investigation?
And I do want to acknowledge, right, that, you know, when you see incidents like that captured on camera, I do believe it triggers trauma for people, you know, in this case, and I'm sure that there were people that looked at that video and they were triggered, that it looked traumatic, and I understand that. And I'm absolutely, you know, empathetic when it comes to that. I will say this about the arrest, the actual use of force. Through every use of force that we go through, there is a multi-layered review. That use of force incident is going through the multi-layered review process as we speak. I will say this, that we had, it was a call for a larceny, or a shoplifting, I'm sorry, at Walgreens. There was we spoke with the manager. There was a very we got a very specific description. The individual was right outside of Walgreens. We approached the individual, officers approached the individual and asked if he was the individual. Did he, you know, steal some candles or something like that? He opened up his bag, he showed us the candles, and as we were trying to get some more information from him and see if there was anything else, he then stopped. He was initially cooperative, then didn't cooperate. We handcuffed him for safety purposes, and when we were about to handcuff him, I'm sorry, there was a struggle. And a couple of officers were struck, pepper spray was deployed. The person that, the quote-unquote suspect that I will say, ran away from the police. At that point, the officers used their batons to try to manage the situation, and that's what you see on the video camera. And there was a bystander who I know saw what was going on. Again, this is going to be part of the review, and engaged with officers.
There was another individual.
In the white shirt.
White shirt.
Yeah.
And
don't know who he was. Well, we know who he was.
And,
but yeah.
And what, for me, and look, I'm not here to disparage the officers on hand without having a context. But there were also, regardless of the questions I'm asked, I still sit here as a black man, and there's a level of kind of anxiety around, do we have another kind of a George Zimmerman, type of person, right? Who feels like I need to be a vigilante in this particular moment. So we're glad that that is being handled. But you mentioned something, I want to go back to it. If it can get handled, we can do it in Cambridge, we can do it anywhere. And a lot of times when we talk about Cambridge, at least when I hear about Cambridge more so than not, we talk about how much money we have, right? But there's in some ways, in terms of just kind of, if I could be transparent, there's sometimes a level of creativity or curiosity, right? In terms of when we think about the national conversation, it comes to us oftentimes, or particularly, we saw it a lot with George Floyd, right? And so how do we utilize George Floyd to inform some of the work that we can do in Cambridge, like Cambridge specific? Obviously, it was an international moment, but how do we utilize that moment here in Cambridge?
One thing that I will say, the George Floyd situation was an absolute tragedy. It was a murder. It was disgusting to watch. What I will say, where we absolutely, I will say, improved from that is, I don't know if you remember the eight that can't wait.
Right, yeah, talk about that. Yeah.
So out of all the 8 that can't wait, and I have a list of them, the one that we didn't have on the books was the duty to intervene, and really having that conversation with our officers about, if you see an officer that is either having a difficult time engaging or de-escalating, or a difficult time connecting with somebody, or even when it comes to the extreme thing is when it comes to using force, you have a duty to go in there and stop that. But even before it gets to that point, we're asking our officers, if you see somebody struggling and you might have a better opportunity to get involved, have somebody do that. Another thing that we really instituted here in the city is really just the strong on-scene supervision. And the data shows that when a supervisor comes on scene and they're not on scene initially and they come later, they have a huge role in defusing an incident, to go in and say, all right, let the initial responding officers take a step back. Let me see what I can do to defuse this. So I really believe in strong on-scene supervision. When it comes to, some of the, I can't even explain what happened to George Floyd in a way that makes sense. Because that didn't make sense. It shouldn't have happened. And I want to believe that it would never happen here with our officers. And,
how do we use George Floyd, or maybe how has the department, not just George Floyd, but there's a bevy of examples, right? If it's Breonna Taylor or Rashad Brooks. I mean, those are situations that end unfortunately in death. But also Sandra Bland. I mean, there's so many, and I don't want to.
Orlando Castile was a really interesting.
That was a tough one. Let's talk about that. I mean, just to kind of in that one particularly for me, it was quite frankly a lack of humanity, right? So how do you utilize that example with the police department, and have a conversation around? It's a young person in the car. There's so many things that are going on.
And we need to, and this is such a great point, Tony, that you're bringing up, is these conversations can't be one-offs. You can't have one conversation about implicit bias and say implicit bias is going to be gone, because you know what, the racism that exists in this country has happened over generations, right? It's embedded, and I honestly believe, systemic, it is embedded in the culture, the foundation of so many of our systems, our criminal justice system, our school system, our healthcare system, our housing, right? And so really getting officers, first of all, just to understand the history of things, and then really educating people on our approach. First of all, can we get officers to understand their implicit bias? So we need to keep on having those conversations and drilling down. And then, I'm just trying to think about, so I think addressing implicit bias is a really big deal. Having conversations about historic injustice, I would say particularly when it pertains to the police, right? I don't think our officers really understand, a lot of our officers, because it's not taught in the police academy, in even the stuff that we've taught in Cambridge. I think we have to go deeper. Really, to your point, when you talk about lived experiences. So having our officers have somebody who have that, when I think about healing the wounds of the past, what I imagine is peace circles, right? With our officers on one end, or officers and our community members. I was recently called, and this was through the C4RJ, which is a mediation group, and they have employed 2 people that have criminal records, and one of the people that has one person that has a criminal record has had killed an officer, and it was called involuntary manslaughter. So he killed an officer, and what they want us to do is have police chiefs sit down with these people who have committed crimes, and they want to apologize, for their crimes and what they did and the harm that they caused to the law enforcement community. And what I think about is how the police need the opportunities to sit down with our communities of color, and even if we didn't directly, feel like directly hurt somebody, understand and feel that pain. Because I think you can't sit opposite another human being and listen to their lived experience and walk away the same, right? If you have somebody that you love and you care about that had that kind of pain, to sit opposite them and hear their story and their experiences of racism throughout their generations, throughout their family, how do you not walk away from that differently? So for me, I think what we need, and I don't even know if I just went down a rabbit hole, what we really need to do is humanize both our police officers that are there wearing the badge, because I'm not just a police officer, and I appreciate that I came here today.
Yeah, we're glad.
I am a mom, I am a sister, I am a daughter, I'm a black woman, right? So I am so many things, and how can we see past this badge? How can we see past somebody's skin color into their real humanity? And that's the work that I think
one thing you talked about is in terms of talking with individuals. And I would be remiss not to say that in terms of, and maybe I'll say it, and I don't want you to feel like I'm pushy here, but there are council members specifically who will utilize Monday night, and I'm not saying they have an animus towards law enforcement. I'm not here to say that. However, they often cite, and I think it's important in some ways, some things that are happening nationally, and the potential, for those things to happen locally. We also have to keep in mind is that in terms of our college students are back, right? And one thing that's really great about college students, and we see it here at our high school, we have a number of young people who really believe in what they believe in, but the conversation around what's going on with regards to policing is going to heighten on social media, heighten, through newspapers or through marches, and we are in a college town. And we also have some folks at City Hall who utilize moments that may happen in Albuquerque, New Mexico. How do you navigate that space on a Monday to say, look, I respect what you have to say, I understand what you're saying, this is Cambridge, and we're going to do it what way?
Right. Well, and I think, and what comes to me as you were talking is that good trouble, right? John Lewis, that good trouble. And I think we need to look at and talk about what's going on nationally. And I think having those conversations makes us better. It makes us stronger.
Sure.
What are some things that we're going to do as a community? And it's not just the police. The police are part of the community to make sure that nothing like that happens here. What are some checks and balances that we have to put in place so that we never have a George Floyd, we never have a Breonna Taylor, right? And those are the conversations, and I appreciate those perspectives because it keeps me on my job, hold me accountable.
Sure.
What am I doing to make sure that that never happens in our community? And I think it's important. And when we look at, I understand again the trauma that was probably triggered through that that video. What do we need to do to explain to our community exactly what happened, being as transparent as possible when it comes to those incidents, to build that trust.
Right.
And I think it really is important. Even if we don't always agree, just come forward with exactly what happened to try to earn that trust. So approaching it as a community. Speaking of
trust, one thing I did in a previous life is that I worked on, it's not about me, I worked on a project in Ferguson after the Michael Brown murder. From that project came Ferguson report, which came out of, as you know, DOJ. Yeah. But one thing that I thought was fascinating about, I was one of many folks, there's hundreds of folks interviewed. How do we get those folks in a room here to kind of look at our policing, good, bad, indifferent, aspirational, like who would need to be at that table? Because I remember being in this table, it was like, I said, for me, it was like, all right, I don't live in Ferguson. I should be the last person asked questions. And then when they kind of revisited, they were talking to the guy at the bodega. They were talking to, the clergy. They were talking to the school clerk, just to get a sense of what it meant to live in that particular community. If you could put some folks in a room to talk about what they have experienced with policing in Cambridge or what they aspirationally would love to see with policing in Cambridge, who would be in that room?
It's interesting. So you're thinking nationally or just from
I'm talking locally, taking that. So essentially, when you think about, even just to give a context, Ferguson, and I'm not, it's about as big as Watertown, right? In terms of even population, it's about 28,000. Someone's going to Google me and say it's 27, and I'm going to be wrong, right? But nonetheless, it's a relatively small place. However, this report was fascinating because it brought a number of stakeholders in to look at a myriad of things. And one thing that we have here in Cambridge, and I'll let you get back to answering this, is that there was a report done a couple of years ago called Shining a Light, and it was written about the African-American experience in Cambridge. And one thing that the report highlights is that the African-Americans who were polled, I can't speak to, I don't know how many folks were polled in this particular report, they had more trust in the police department than they had in the schools.
Interesting.
And when you look at the Ferguson report, you see some similarities. I say that to say that in terms of the experiences that are articulated in this report of folks' educational experiences, it would behoove one to make the assumption that there was maybe some premeditation to have a relationship with the police department. So Who's in that room for you, though, so that we don't create this pipeline?
It's really interesting. So when I think about the city of Cambridge, I think about, so I'm pretty confident in the fact that not everybody in the city of Cambridge sees the police as a resource that they would call for help, sees the police as somebody that, that they trust. And then there are people that see the police as a resource and somebody they can call for help. So I want to, during my administration or during my tenure, I want to reach out to all of our community members and what do I need to do so that every one of our community members sees the police from, people from the immigrant community.
Right.
I don't care if you're documented or undocumented. So how do I get, people who have struggled with domestic violence, domestic and gender-based violence, how do I get people to see that you can call us as a resource, you can call us for help. So I really want to reach people, and when I think about the work that the Cambridge Police Department does, and we can talk about being a data-driven department, so I really want to go into the communities where we spend a lot of our time and say, what is your experience with the police? And I have had some conversations in the whatever six weeks or so that I've been in this position, where people will say to me, we've had gun violence in our community, and I see the police in our community, but they're in their cruisers with their windows rolled up and they're on their phone. How come they won't come out and talk to me? So, what do I need to do? And I don't know if this is answering the question or not, but what do I need to do to make sure that our officers have the skills and abilities and the confidence to get out of that cruiser to engage? So what is it that we need to do? Why is it that, first of all, the officers aren't getting out? How do I support them in saying, people want to engage with you, people want to see you, especially in the communities that we're spending a lot of our time.
Can I ask you a follow-up question to that? Do you think that in terms of where we are with the national conversation, that we have may in some ways place cops in a compromising position where they're like, look, I don't want to get out this car because I have 20 cameras in front of me, camera phones, and I may just be saying hello to a friend, and then we create this, potentially contentious situation that was essentially something that was, a hello between
and what
individuals.
does that speak to?
And what does that speak to?
The fact that there are members in our community that do not see the police as a resource, as somebody that they can turn to for help, as somebody that's there to support them and keep the community safe. So what do we need to do to change that narrative? And I'll tell you right now, and I'm really going to address what happened this summer, because there were a lot of concerns around gun violence in our city, and this was particularly in the Port neighborhood. And we were really concerned. There was some retaliation going back and forth. There was some, I think, disputes between people in Cambridge, and there were some groups in surrounding communities, and we were concerned about it. And one of the things that I was thinking about is that there was nobody else to turn to figure out how to solve this issue. So what we did is we put our police officers in those spots where the gun violence was happening, almost having a police officer on every corner. And we were really purposeful with how we engaged, because in some of the communities, it was around housing developments. Well, it was a hot summer. People are outside and they're drinking beer and they're, enjoying music and they're with their friends. And we want people to be able to enjoy the nice weather and, have a beer with their friends without having the police, enforcing for drinking in public, when for some people that's their backyard. So how do we balance that? And it was really challenging for us, and we worked really closely with the Cambridge Housing Authority. They hired a security firm just to balance people's rights just to be outside and enjoying the good weather, but with our responsibility of keeping people safe. And that's really what we wanted to do. So I will knock on wood and say that the gun violence has quieted down over the last 6 weeks, thank goodness. And but we still haven't, I don't know that we've deepened any relationships in the communities, and I don't know that we've solved any root causes of gun violence. And I do believe gun violence is, a public health concern, and how do we approach it that way when you have 15-year-olds and 18-year-olds with, automatic weapons and 30, round magazines. what sort of trauma did that young person experience that they are picking up those high capacity weapons and potentially hurting another person? What do we have to do as a community? And I will tell you, Tony, if any place can get it right, it is the city of Cambridge. We could literally count, right? And wrap our arms around the young people that are picking up guns in our community. What do we, and we can't do it by ourselves. It can't just be a police response. It has to be.
So to that, who needs to be at that table, right? I think a lot of times, because, once again, okay, just let me know when to be there, but who needs to be at that table? Because oftentimes, and we know this, and folks here have done this before, and even prior to me, I'm certain the Mayor Reeves has done this, or has been a part of it. I don't want to disparage anyone who's done this work, but we are quick to provide programs, but there's very little work around implementation. How we're monitoring those particular programs. How are we working with those? If it's a small amount of young people who have maybe been directly impacted by that gun violence, right? Or even the perpetuation of gun violence, and some of the things in which we see online. And I know that, and thank you. I had reached out to you and gave a parent your information because there was a young person being bullied and threatened with gun violence over the weekend. But we know that in terms of there is a small swatch of folks, and I'm not here to say this person should be here, this person should be there, but I will say, how do we get the schoolhouse? We still are a relatively small district, right? We're a little under 7,000 folks. We have 2,200 staff members. So every staff, we can assign every staff member to 3 kids. How can we think creatively to make sure we're touching every young person in our district or in our community, in our schools or in our charters or maybe out of district, who lives, all the young people in our city to understand that CPD is different. And how do we do that? And and it's not just on you. I don't want to put it all on you. Right?
And I really feel like we have a model that has been effective.
Talk about what you guys do differently.
I'm going to talk about safety net, and I'm going to talk about the fact that I feel like over the last decade, we have built amazing relationships between not just the police and our young people in the city across the board. I mean, I'm sitting here, I'm looking at Joey, who I knew when he was, I don't even know how old, going to the Area 14 Center, now Moses Teen Center, but it really is about having those relationships with the young people from very young, but working collaboratively with our schools, with our human service department, having some, professional social workers. We have a psychologist, the Cambridge Health Alliance is involved, the Department of Children and Families, and really identifying early kids that are struggling, not just kids, but also families. A lot of times when you see a young person that's struggling and you dig a little deeper, there's some challenges at home. So what do we need to do? And a lot of the root of that, it is systemic. It goes for generations. It can be linked to racism. It can be linked to so many different things. So what do we need to do as a community so that we're healthy? We have a healthy community, that we're helping, identifying young people that are struggling, giving not only them, but their family, the supports that they need. And I think if any place we can do it right, we can do it here. And I do believe it has to be a collaborative approach. I think there's a combination, for me, of lived experience. I would love to see some, adult mentors that have had some challenging times come to the table with us. Love to see some licensed professionals come to the table. Love to see some, I think, again, our schools, the Cambridge Health Alliance, our Human Services Department, having, programs that are working. And one thing, when I think about our program, and we call them youth resource officers, because we're not just in the schools. So our youth resource officers are also, we wrap our arms around the kids at every point in their life. So we see them during school, we see them during after school, we see them during holidays, we see them during the summertime, and we're engaging with the young people all year round, during the day, at night. We see them activities. Our police officers are coaches and mentors and all of these different things to our young people, and we've built these amazing relationships. So people, and we've had parents and other teachers saying, we're having a problem, we really want to talk to Officer Whitey, we're having a problem, we really want to talk to Officer Pam. And we're able to solve problems through the relationships that we've built, and intervene in conflicts that we know are happening between young people, between neighborhoods, and really working with Chandra Banks through the mediation program. I think that has been, just amazing resources and amazing partnerships. And it's not even so much about the money, it's about the relationships. The relationships that we have in the city, and I'm looking out there at Mayor Reeves, who has known me since I came on the job 26 years ago when he was the mayor, and he'd be out there in Central Square telling me, yeah, you gotta go here, you gotta go there. These relationships that we've built, I think they're so tight and they're built on trust. And the fact that everybody in this community, right, we all want the same thing. We care about the people in this community, and we want to make a difference with the people in this community. So how do we work together to improve outcomes across the board?
With that being said, you think about the community, and you mentioned this earlier, kind of a regional approach. There has been, at least if not truth, it's been some rumors that we are having, some issues, or there have been some squabbles with neighboring communities. How do you leverage the YROs in this particular case to kind of get around that, right? To kind of support, I don't want to say bad actors, but let's just say young people who are struggling, some young people who have been compromised a little bit. How do we support these young people with our neighboring partners in a more holistic type of way?
It's really interesting because I think about the resources that we have in this city to really, when I think about like prevention and early intervention, when we see a young person going down that path, we really do have the resources. A young person is picking up guns. We have the focused deterrence program. We have a youth resource officers. We have humans. All these people that are there to support that young person.
Talk about the focused deterrent. You don't got.
Yeah, the focused deterrent.
Yeah, just talk about it.
Just
give
really
like 30
quickly.
seconds
So
on
that
each one
has
of
been for young. This is a program that started probably a decade ago for young people who people who have been involved with gun violence, either been in the system. It is really a program where we're reaching out to people who have been involved in gun violence and say, how do we keep you on a positive path? If you've been down again, if you're picking up guns, or if you're at risk, or if we heard your name, we have these resources for you. Let's go this way instead of going that way, right? Okay. So again, it really is about providing people with resources and giving them options other than the gun violence. But what I want to say quickly is that what I realize is not every community has the same resources that we do. So we do when there has been gun violence involving the neighbors in Somerville. Somerville, unfortunately, doesn't have the same resources as Cambridge. When we ask them, well, listen, we're having a problem over there, we need to send some, we don't have anybody to send, right? Well, they could be gun, all right, we'll do the best that we can, but we don't have the same resources that.
So how do we push on like the school, right? I know that I guess we're playing them in the football game.
Oh yeah.
And maybe I'm just thinking too much like a Cambridge person, right? But how do we get these kids, the football players, if that be, let's get them all in an auditorium. Yeah. Bring one school, get them on a bus. Let's have a conversation. I mean, we may not necessarily have the same, dollars, but how do we get folks to? How do we get the schoolhouse and then we get the police commissioners in there and think about that? Like, how do we do that?
Yeah, I would love to do some out of the box thinking with a city like Somerville because we are so close and we have so many things.
And we share
common.
Sports teams in some cases.
We do.
Yeah, we have our kids on the same teams.
And we're so close. And what these young people, the feud is about. I mean, this is something we can solve. People's lives don't need to be lost. Sure. How do we come to a better outcome? But again, also, how do we address that trauma? Right? What is going on? Mm-hmm. And I would love to have some creative solutions. One thing that we've done here in the city of Cambridge is we have gone nationally to talk about our model. We think our model is one that works. I think the last stats that I was looking at in 2020, I think maybe it was even 2019, a low of 6 juvenile arrests for the entire year. Right. And when it came to our schools, I think there were 2, and we only had 2 in the schools, and they were mandatory arrests, and there was something about carrying a weapon, and there was another one involving domestic violence. I really think if other communities model our approach, maybe we can, wrap the same safety nets around and compare notes about who's at risk and how we can intervene effectively.
How do you do that? It's a delicate dance, right? Because in terms of I'm not in any particular form, calling we arrest young people or any of that particular nature. But there have been situations where in terms of there may be need to kind of be like a tougher talk, if you may. Like, do you think that because we're such a place where we want to do things a little bit differently, a little more hands-off, that we run the risk of not getting folks to understand that there are grave consequences if they don't shape up, if you may?
I wouldn't say hands-off. I think we are hands-on. One of the things I feel about once you get that record, right?
Right.
Is, particularly for some of the violent offenses, you have a gun charge
Gotcha.
on your record, that is unforgiving, and that will follow you for the rest of your life. So I understand our approach here, and one of the things that I was having conversations before, if you haven't hurt anybody yet, right, what can we do? If we know somebody has picked up a firearm, is the only answer for that young person is just to throw the book at them, they are done, put them, in the jail, put them under the jail, because, I don't even understand. I've heard this concept before. Oh, he's a bad guy. What does that mean?
Right.
He's 15. He's not a bad guy. He's a child who has been traumatized. So I don't believe in people being inherently bad. I think bad things have happened to people, and trauma, and mental illness can create all sorts of scenarios, but I do not believe in inherently bad people. I don't. So what do we need to do? What do we need to uncover to support people, and what sort of supports do we need to be put around them? And I do believe in, if you have somebody who has that lived experience, who has, done a bit in prison, talking to a young person, that can be probably just as scary as going to jail, themselves. So how do we really leverage the resources that we have in this community, including people with those lived experiences, to maybe Scared Straight? And I know that was a program that probably didn't work, but something around that.
Let's talk to that, though. And one of the things you've mentioned, a number of times is trauma in individuals. But I would love to get an understanding of where your office, where your department is around supporting the whole family. Considering, the work you're doing with CHA and, just what does that look like? What do those familial supports look like? Particularly because you mentioned the trauma, and in some cases, intergenerational trauma. A trauma in which you may have 5 family members in a home who have 5 distinctly different perspectives around policing, right? Because of their lived experiences and or their perceived experiences.
So, and again, Tony, I think this is one where we have to approach it collaboratively, not just with the police. One thing that we have noticed through our outreach over the last decade is there are some people that do not want the police to come to their house at all. And I respect that. Okay, all right, there's been some trauma there. You don't trust the police. Who else? Who do you trust? Who can we, who can help reach this family? Who can help provide the supports that they need to, because we want people to succeed, right? Especially people who have struggled. So how do we work collaboratively to get to the people that are struggling, and what do we need to do? And for me, it's about not giving up and keep, let's try. What is it that you need? Is it job opportunities? Is it, mental health treatment? Is it, what is it that people need that we can provide? And I think the city council and our city manager wants to know, what do we need to do? How do we do it better? And again, if anybody can do it, we can do it with the resources we have in this community. So if there are people out there listening that have some ideas, I am open, and I have a year, to get some things done. I want to work collaboratively with people. Some of the approaches, the alternative approaches that we're looking at now, I know the city is 100% committed to having a response that's other than the police, response to people in crisis. Again, how do we work collaboratively to
let's talk about that, right? So one of the things, I love the idea of working collaboratively. But I've also learned that in terms of 90,000 voices may not necessarily get us to the destination that we need to be at. You mentioned this a couple of times around in terms of our responses, and sometimes folks feel like they don't want officers to show up. As you know, there are 2 proposals that are on the docket with our city. I think there's a larger, another conversation that will go on November 17th.
Yeah.
Both the HART proposal and I believe the proposal that has been brought forth by the city manager task force. Can you talk a little bit about those proposals, perspectives?
I would like to speak first to the HART proposal because I get it. I understand the passion behind that proposal. I understand what it's rooted in. I understand I understand why people don't want to talk to the police and don't want to work with the police. I understand why HART is really committed to not working within a system. I understand it intellectually. I get it. And then, you know, one of the things that I think about with that is I just find that there is a tremendous opportunity. When I think about my role, I entered in a system that I knew was flawed, right? And part of my thinking and why I was so passionate about it, and this almost speaks to my tenacity and resilience, is I wanted to go in there and really bring some heart, my own heart, right? To
bring that on November 17th.
Right, to this job.
Right.
And try to change some things from the inside. How can we do policing better? How do we, you know, make it more diverse? How do we change how we engage? And one thing that I'll say, and I feel like I'm going off, but when I was getting backgrounded, and I don't remember, Joey might have even been there was a group of young people, all black males, that found out I was being backgrounded for the police department, and we were walking to Central Square. It was after the St. Night closed, and they were like, "Christine, why are you going to become a police officer?" And I remember asking them specifically, and this was, you know, over 26 years ago. And I said, "Why don't you want me to be a police officer?" And these were little kids, probably 10, 11, 12. The police don't like us. The police are mean to us. We don't like the police. And for me, it was like, these are babies that are feeling this way. How do we change that? And I brought that through the academy into my work as a patrol officer, and now as the first, you know, whatever, acting commissioner, the first female in this job, bringing those 12-year-old voices to my job. I cannot imagine, I don't know, I just think, how do we have to do it differently. We have to do it better. And really connecting, again, more effectively so that people don't feel that way. So going back to HART, I just feel like there are opportunities. There are so many calls that we're responding to now that would be so much better suited for an alternative response. I think our officers say, why are the police responding? We shouldn't be responding to this. But I'll tell you one thing. In the 10 years that we've been doing this outreach work, we have built amazing relationships with the unhoused community, with people who are struggling with mental illness, with service providers. And we can, when the HART proposal gets going, hey, how do we, you know, help you navigate? And yes, you can take this call. I think that having a proposal like HART, I think that this can happen, and I think it's gonna happen in layers. I think there has to be this kind of layered approach. We get in together, slowly understand. I don't think you can just start it off at you know, 0 to 60, but how do we baby step into moving things away from the police into an alternative response, keeping people out of crisis. One of the things that HART brought up that I'm really interested in figuring out how we do is, well, we don't take any notes. We don't put anything in databases. And a lot of things that we do is not necessarily to put people in the system, so to speak, but it is to, we can see when people's behavior is escalating. You know, we see, geez, we saw little Johnny today and he seems okay, but then we saw him the next day and his behavior is getting worse, and then we saw him again. And we've seen people where their behavior is escalating, and we're able, if you think about prevention, early intervention, we're able to say, okay, I think he's off his medications or whatever, we need to provide some resources to this person before he goes into that acute crisis. So how do we do that as a community? So I understand, again, I know HART people that are watching are probably going crazy, that's exactly what we're talking about, but I just feel like there are opportunities for us to work to where they want to go, but I think it's going to take a process, and I think it's going to be slow.
So one thing about maybe not, I don't want to talk about the HART folks. Okay. I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to get in no trouble. But I will say, in terms of like some of the folks who put that great proposal forth, and the other folks from the city manager's team who put together an admirable proposal as well. But I'll go back to those 12-year-olds who felt like, why is she doing this? many of them may have felt like a lot of folks that we need to look at the police budget a little differently, considering a number of things that are going across the nation. There's this idea around we have to siphon dollars from police departments because they can be allocated different places. If it's to heart, if it's to the 12-year-olds, whoever it is. How do you speak to the call to look at your budget and then keeping in mind, and I'm not here counting anyone's dollars, right? Our school budget is a little over maybe like over 200 million, let's just say over 2 million. You guys are about 66, 67, yes. Right? And going back to the conversation the point I made earlier, there are some folks who have felt like the schools have done, this is Tony, have done more harm than the police in Cambridge. I'm not saying in the nation, but some would argue, if you look at a number of communities, some folks would say that. But there is an attack, right? Sure. Small a, around what the budget should and should not have, where it should be taken at. How do you have those conversations, considering that you're going into this alternative policing discussion as well, where some folks may say, look, yeah, you see I can do this really well. We need more money. We need more money. What does that look like?
And for me, one of the things that when I think about the core functions of police, right? Public safety, addressing crime, enforcing the law. If we reduce police to our core functions, what that takes away, and where I believe so much of our budget has changed. So from our budget, it's 95% salaries.
Right.
And where we have increased, at least over the past 3 years, where we have increased, and our numbers have only increased 6 positions, although we're still like way down. I think we're down like 20 police officers right now, and we're struggling to hire them. Is if we reduce some of those critical functions that we've been engaged in, what that goes after when they start to peel back our budget, it goes after some of the, I think, amazing work that we've been doing. Our YRO program, our Family and Social Justice program goes, our clinical support unit goes, we have a domestic violence. So all of the work that we've been doing that really is designed to address root causes of issues, it goes away, and it really limits our ability to build those deep connections and deep relationships to address some of those critical issues. I feel really strongly about having the police be part of the community and not somebody that you just call out in an emergency, because when you have somebody who's in crisis, if you've already built those relationships, if you already are proactively looking at conflict and relationships, we can stop a problem hopefully before it gets to that acute stage. So I really do believe that we have a critical role. One of the things, if we can just look at the last, they cut our budget in 2020 by 2.5 million. And what that caused was a delay in our police academy, which was one of the most diverse classes that we had. A delay in the second class. We didn't fill some key positions, sworn as well as non-sworn. And what's interesting that although, let me see, there is this call to defund when it comes to wanting police officers in certain places to address crime and fear of crime. We're struggling to hit all those spaces that we need police. Yeah. We need police at our wellness centers and in some of our shelters, and we've committed these resources to police. So the more that, so we have a lot of commitments that we have to honor, and how do we do that if we continue?
Do you think that, just in terms of follow-up to that, considering that all the things that you mentioned from the YROs do specifically, do you think that there needs to be better communication to the public around the great things that are happening with these dollars? Because part of it, at least just speaking, for myself, if I have a line, if I understand where the line items are going, I still may disagree on a myriad of things, but I think that for me, if a bunch of that is going towards the development, the lion's share to young people, do you think you guys, and I love some of the folks over at your shop, but how do you market that better? How do we get a better understanding? And on top of that, right, how do we get other champions to talk to that work? If it's the pastors or versus, coaches? How do we get folks to understand that work a little better?
And really, a big part of that, and what I feel is my role, is really being out in the community and getting our feedback from our community about how we're doing. What do you, what do you know about your police department? So surveys. So one of the things that we're in the process of doing now, particularly in the areas where we do have, according to data, so we do have a large police presence, is getting feedback about how we're doing. So we have these feedback cards. They're going out in 7 different languages. They're going to be in our senior centers. They're going to be in our shelters. They're going to be in our housing developments, getting feedback about what do you see, what do you want from the police department? How are we delivering our services? How can we improve? And I don't think, and I've heard this before, that a lot of people, even though it's been in effect for over a decade, a lot of people don't know about our safety net program. A lot of people don't know about our outreach. A lot of people don't know that we have, 2 social workers and a psychologist on staff, and that we practice case management, and that arrests are one of our very last resorts when it comes to how we engage. And people who come into our I would say people who go to our police academy, which is why we can talk about our police academy if you want. We changed academies because we really wanted people who were trained in really the Cambridge way about how we do business.
Right.
So it's
I
about
think
training.
I think it's an opportunity. This is, if I may, to kind of spend some time shepherding the city.
Yes.
If it's at Roosevelt Towers or Rens Towers, and just kind of speaking to the work in which you guys are doing or even forecasting doing.
Yeah.
But I want to go back to mental health.
Sure.
One of the things that I often see, and it's a personal story, but it's one in which it actually occurred today. My child had a dentist appointment this afternoon. It's good. No cavity. He's good. So we passed by Cass and Mass Ave, so we were there, and I like sneakers, and he said to me when we got home, "Daddy, you have to give some of your sneakers away," because I saw some people without sneakers, without shoes, and so we're going to figure that out. But he can't pick. I can pick. With that being said, we see, and this is Carl Barron Square, Harvard Square. I've even seen pockets in Porter Square.
Yep.
How do we address that, considering that earlier we talked about the Hart proposal and not kind of having cops address nonviolent issues, if you may? But how do we navigate these spaces, right? Considering that, and this is more so maybe on our city officials, we know that some folks come to Cambridge to be set up in shelters later, right? It's some folks, it's a strategy. Other folks, it's just because it's at one bus, and it's a number of things. But how do we support? And other folks are my classmates, maybe your classmates, right? Our neighbors, right? These are our family members.
Yep.
How do we, and not putting this on you, but how do we create a wraparound space to protect our fellow citizens and support them in the Carl Barron Squares and the Harvard Squares and pockets of Porter?
I'll tell you, and from my perspective, it's such a complex issue, but I really believe that the city is doing so much work when it comes to how we support our unhoused. And I will tell you, because I was on the ground during COVID, and one of the things that we were worried about was our shelters and what happens if people start to get sick. So we worked with the health department. Claude Jacobs was amazing.
Right.
The police department, we all came together, and we had the War Memorial Shelter that was, in play for at least a year. And that was a real complex project of making sure that we had an isolation and then a general, just all different places in case people got sick. And then after that was gone, we gave it back to the school. There was the wellness, Spalding Wellness Center that's on Cambridge Street that has 60 beds. The state is funding a MEMA shelter that's on Green Street that has another 60 beds, 240 Albany Street. We have the warming center that opens up on December 1st that offers another probably 35 to 40 places for people to sleep. There's the Salvation Army. So, and then not to mention all of the resources that the city offers from food to vaccines to needle exchange and all different things. So the city, I think, has committed so many resources to support our unhoused. And when we go out, and really it's collaborative, we have the multidisciplinary outreach team, because there is a certain segment of unhoused that do not want to use the shelters, right, for whatever reason, and how do we make sure that they're okay. So every Wednesday we go out, and we go out with clinicians and people from Pro Ambulance to make sure that the people who are not accessing the shelters are okay, that they don't need medical treatment, that they have clean, dry socks. And we've done sock drives at the police department to give out wool socks to our unhoused. And there's just so many resources, again, that the city has. And what we're doing now with Mass and Cass is, if we do get an influx of people, there's just making sure, offering people services, and say, you are absolutely, welcome here in our city, but the encampments are unsafe. Not only are they a public health emergency, there are also some safety issues, serious safety issues around that. So we're really trying to balance the, having a compassionate, empathetic approach with people who are unhoused, sometimes suffering from addiction and mental health issues. How do we provide them with the services and in treatment, like dignity, right? Treating people with dignity and respect. So we're working very closely with Public Works. Owen O'Riordan has been great. If we have to store, if people have too much stuff that they can't carry and we have to store it, we will store stuff. We've gotten people into shelters where they can get some support. So we're doing the best that we can to manage a very complex issue as a city.
You mentioned oftentimes, at least the last couple of months, we've talked about the dollars that we've gotten from the Biden administration. And obviously, if you don't, seems like your department is strapped, considering that, there are some spots that you have not filled. And we can talk more about recruiting later in terms of how do we get those particular filled. But just kind of in terms of, when we think about the federal dollars that are coming or are here in this city, if you were to have your dream to kind of deploy some of those dollars doing something, what would that look like?
Mental health.
Mental health.
Mental health.
Okay.
Absolutely. I think when it comes to mental health, we cannot serve the people adequately that need the services that they need. And I know for a fact that there are waiting lists when it comes to getting people counseling or just services that they need that are struggling with mental health issues. That is one of the major needs, I would say, across the country, but absolutely here in the city of Cambridge.
As we come a little bit more time, but I want to, one thing that I think both the Hart proposal and a number of proposals that have come forth to the City Council and the discussion that's happening nationally is the semantics. From a police department maybe to a department maybe named public safety. Yeah. How do we, or should we, think about a name change? And if so, or if not, what are the implications one way or the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm open to the conversation.
Yeah.
One of the things that we were talking about, and I'm going to mention our youth resource officers,
Gotcha.
In conversation with some of the school committee members, and one of the things that they said, I mean, something that always comes up is, do they have to carry a firearm? And
right.
Yes, right? So look at Mass General Law, and that is, and if you want to talk about union issues, right, that is absolutely part of the role of police officers when it comes to.
We're going to go there a little bit before we have 15 minutes left. We'll go there. That may be like part 2.
And so, there are barriers when it comes to, you're going to have armed police, right?
Yeah.
But where I do feel like there is some flexibility is when it comes to our schools, do we have to be in full uniform? And that's where I think we need to have the conversation of because I think our school resource or our youth resource program is too valuable to just do away with. Mm-hmm. And if the uniforms are a huge barrier, let's have some flexibility. Let's have some conversations. We can have dress down. We can have concealed. These are conversations that I'm willing to have with the school committee, and I think we are going to be having.
Great. We have a couple of minutes left, and I want to kind of start where we began. We are a nation that, quite frankly, doesn't have enough folks in the position who look like you, who have your lived experience. With that being said, you are going to have to navigate a space that is male-dominated in a lot of ways. Unions haven't always been fun to play with. Yeah. What does that look like for you as a leader? And kind of give us a little bit of your leadership philosophy.
Sure. You know, I really developed, to your point, right? Pretty much all of my role models when it comes to policing were men, right? Mostly white men.
Right.
But what I learned from, I'm going to highlight Commissioner Robert Haas, who had a huge impact on me personally. And after the Gates arrest, one of the things that really became the foundation of how I move through my existence is when I think about strengthening legitimacy and treating people with respect and dignity. So the way I lead, I believe I'm a democratic leader when if possible, I want to have a consensus. Let's all talk about it when we have time, right? We can do that. There are going to be other times when I have to make a decisive decision, if no problem doing that. But if at all possible, I'd like to try to figure out how everybody feels. But also the thing is internally and externally, making sure that people feel like they have a voice in the process. Whatever decisions that we're going to make, whatever we're going to do, if we're going to have policy changes or uniform changes, making sure that people are part of that process, right? And then when we make a decision, making sure that that decision is communicated in a way that builds trust and transparency internally and externally. So that is the foundation of everything that I do. So, you know, there have been times when people may talk to me in a way that they wouldn't talk to, let's just say Commissioner Bard, for example, right? And, you know, my response is, excuse me, you know, I'm going to treat you with respect and dignity. I expect the same back. So it's almost, you know, you can always have a poker face on, right? Never let them see you sweat. You always want to smile. You want to treat people with respect and ask for that same respect back. And I think for me, you know, I'm a woman and I bring that to my role. I'm also a mother, and I think a lot of times the way I lead, it could be a little maternal. It's just, okay, let's just explain what this is going on. I see you're frustrated or whatever the case may be. So I really feel like that is a strength, and I feel like that my male colleagues have responded well to it, at least to my face. I don't know what they do behind my back, but.
How does your time in the Navy inform your leadership at all?
I don't think at all. I almost want to.
Okay.
For me, it was great as a young person. I needed that kick in the tail. I needed to get my head together. One of the things that I learned from the Navy is that the pay is terrible. The food was terrible. And I knew that this is not what I wanted to do. So what the Navy did for me is, Christine, you got to get back to school. You got to get a focus. And that really, you do not want, for me, I did not want that to be a career. I mean, it's an honorable career. It's great for people. It wasn't good for me. But it did give me what I needed to come out. I grew up, went back to school, and I was able to bring some discipline and focus to everything that I do.
So as we come to an end, I would love to just hear more about, as a community, what can we do? I mean, you know, maybe that's a big W for me, at least, is that in terms of one thing that we have in this city is that we have too many interims. We have a penchant for the word interim, and I think it builds a level of instability. And so what do we as a community need to do in supporting you to shift that acting or interim, whatever the title is, so that we can set forth the next 5, 10, 15 years of this movement here in Cambridge? What does that look like?
You know, for me, when I think of interim, it speaks to a little bit of my resolve, a little bit of my tenacity, and I want to earn this job. So I want to earn the trust. I want to earn the community members to say, that's who I want. So this wasn't the Cambridge community saying, yes, we selected you. This was, you know, somebody saying, okay, you're going to be in the seat. So now let's spend the next year talking to people, earning that trust, earning this position by holding me accountable. So I look at the interim label as an opportunity to earn this position.
So considering that in terms of talking to community, is there a prioritization of what communities you talk to first, and how do you? So I have an acronym that I'm working off of that I'm prioritizing right now. It's called ACT. So accountability, community, transparency, and safety. Those are my priorities for the next year, right? So reaching out, and I will say, I absolutely have a desire to build trust in communities that have not traditionally trusted the police. Understanding the history of this country, the history of police in this country. So there's some work that we need to do, particularly in our brown and black communities. I'm ready to have
difficult conversations and try to build that trust and really humanize the Cambridge Police Department, because again, we are not just police officers, we are, family members, we are human beings, right?
Right.
And also having more conversations like this where we're taking off the uniform, breaking bread, how do we do that, more effectively so we have an entire police department that feels comfortable engaging. So really focusing in on, again, accountability, like making sure that police are holding me and our police officers accountable. Did you have a bad experience? We want to know about that. What do we need to do? The transparency, I'm committed to Bard's dashboard. We are gonna have a dashboard. So we're probably gonna have some more conversations once that dashboard comes out. The picture it paints is the picture it paints. And then, what sort of training or what do we need to institute to make sure that there aren't disparities if some do come up?
There is a disparity in the fact that in terms of, we started this conversation off with, you think about yourself, Commissioner Outlaw, Commissioner Shields. There's not enough. When you Google, women commissioners, there's not many. And I don't know if you've done this lately, but your name actually comes up first.
Oh, really?
Because it's the most recent.
Okay.
And then when you click on, it's not many names after. So considering, in a lot of ways, I mean, this is very, we have Mayor Reeves here, but I remember that moment. It was a monumental moment, not just locally, but unfortunately nationally, right? Unfortunately, right? Because the reality is that in terms of, I shouldn't have to see that in my teenage years, like this is the first time, so on and so forth.
Right.
But this is a seminal moment. How do you kind of, I don't want to say bask in it, while at the same time understanding, you spoke earlier about mental health and preserving ourselves and taking care of ourselves. So how are you taking care of yourself in this moment, understanding that even if folks want to argue with you or debate around the Hart proposal here in Cambridge, when a young woman or a young man, whoever, does what I did last night, you come up first, right? Because of the recency. And then when you click on that, there's not many lines after yours. So how do you take care of you in this moment and understand how big the moment is? Just as it was in your moment, it was a pretty big moment.
Yeah. For me, I'm just focusing not on that big global picture. I'm focusing in on the work that I need to do here. For me, one of the big, it's almost, I can't believe that we're still talking about firsts.
Right.
In 2021. I mean, I was born in 1967, right, during the kind of height of the civil rights movement. Here we are 54 years later.
Right.
And we still are talking about firsts in Cambridge.
Right.
So for me, I'm like, why is this still happening? We still haven't had a woman president. Why are we still talking about first? It just, for me, this just seems, I don't know, there's something wrong with it.
So are we that different? Are we that different?
Are we that different?
Yeah, are we that
How
different?
far have
How
we
far
come,
have we-
right?
how far
That's a
have we
really
come?
interesting
Yeah.
conversation. So I don't think about this in that way. I think about it just as we got a lot of work to do.
Right.
We got a lot of work to do. I have a lot of work to do internally to make sure succession planning, training, I might be the first, I'm not going to be the last, certainly not here in Cambridge. So it really is about building up a team of people who are ready to lead after me, women, people of color, across the board.
Definitely. I want to thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm excited about this moment, and we look forward to working with you.
Yeah, it was a
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.